Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the fascinating and honestly sometimes frustrating world of solar project development through the lens of the SASB standards. We're looking at a massive paradox right at the heart of modern solar energy, one that actually dictates the power flowing to your home and, yeah, the size of your utility bill. See, on one hand, solar panels are getting ridiculously cheap and efficient. But on the other hand, this unstoppable technological force is slamming into an invisible wall made of two incredibly stubborn materials: aging electrical grids and constantly shifting public policies. To get a sense of this, just look at this core requirement from the SASB framework: preventing systemic disruptions to the existing energy infrastructure. It is a huge deal. Think about it kind of like trying to run a fleet of magnetic levitation bullet trains on 19th century wooden tracks. Right now, we're trying to push highly efficient but highly variable solar power into a legacy grid that was built for massive, steady fossil fuel plants. So to keep the whole system from literally crashing, solar developers have to deploy some seriously rigorous risk management. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be covering the integration challenge, diving into standard 410A.1 on hardware and risks, looking at innovation in LCOE, exploring standard 410A.2 regarding policy and software, analyzing tariff reforms, and wrapping up with the ecosystem in evolution. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the integration challenge, when new tech meets old grids.
So under SASB metric 410A1, companies actually have to outline their physical integration risks, and these basically break down into two main buckets: technological and operational. On the tech side, developers are constantly running into limited transmission connectivity and a totally fragmented maze of inverter interconnection rules across different regions. Then on the operational side, well, the sun just doesn't shine 24/7, right? And that variability creates curtailment. Curtailment is this massive headache where a solar farm generates perfectly good power, but the grid simply cannot absorb it. Because of this, in some regions, millions of megawatt hours of perfectly clean energy are literally just thrown away every single year because the legacy infrastructure can't handle the surge. Section 2, Standard 410A, Hardware and Risks. Overcoming physical barriers. Now, developers obviously can't just sit around waiting for grid upgrades. They have to proactively engineer their way around these bottlenecks. How do they do that? Well, they're deploying smart inverters that actually communicate directly with the grid to manage the flow of electricity. They're also installing massive battery storage systems to capture all that curtailed energy and save it for a cloudy day. Sometimes, they even bypass the legacy grid altogether by designing isolated microgrids. And lastly, they manage risk through strategic project siting, literally scouring the map for geographies where legacy transmission capacity is still robust. Basically, these hardware solutions act as a sort of physical armor against grid failures. Section 3, Innovation and LCOE, the economics of integration. All of this hardware innovation brings us right to the levelized cost of energy, or LCOE. As you probably know, this is the average cost of electricity over a power plant's entire lifetime. Now, better hardware definitely gets you a lower initial LCOE, but to really drive that final cost down, you have to slash the soft costs. And crucially, pushing that LCOE down is heavily dependent on how well a company navigates utility tariff reforms. Efficiently acquiring customers and structuring your financing around local utility rates is what ultimately drops that final LCOE and makes solar economically irresistible to the wider market. But here's the catch. Mastering the hardware is really only half the battle. We have to ask ourselves, how do political decisions reshape these technological challenges? Because honestly, no matter how brilliant your battery storage tech is, the rules of the game, the ones set by regulators, can literally make or break a project overnight. So let's shift our focus from the physical hardware of the grid to the software of legislation. Section 4, Standard 410A.2, Policy and Software. The power of the legislative pen. This is exactly where SASB metric 410A2 comes in. It measures this immense legislative impact. Specific public policies quite literally dictate a project's monetization potential. Take net metering policies, for instance. These determine exactly how consumers get credited for pumping excess power back into the grid. Then you've got feed-in tariffs that offer long-term contracts, time-of-use rates that shift pricing based on when energy is most valuable, and renewable portfolio standards that set hard legal minimums for green energy usage. These policies are essentially the software rules that developers must relentlessly track and adapt to if they want to stay financially viable. Section 5, Tariff Reforms and Impact, Financing the Solar Revolution. Beyond those operational rules, governments also use very specific financial levers to shape the entire energy landscape. Under the SASB framework, companies are required to evaluate the financial impact of utility tariff reforms and structural incentives as core business risks. This means developers have to heavily analyze things like investment tax credits, property-assessed clean energy programs, direct government loan guarantees, and accelerated depreciation tax schedules. The stroke of a pen altering any of these financial mechanisms can fundamentally rewrite a solar project's balance sheet for better or for worse. So this whole regulatory landscape, it is absolutely a double-edged sword. On one side, you have significant policy risks. Think about international trade disputes that could suddenly disrupt the polysilicon supply chain, or changing rules around the external social costs of distributed generation. But then on the flip side, the policy opportunities are just massive. You have direct government subsidization and vast, state-funded initiatives specifically aimed at replacing that aging transmission infrastructure we talked about earlier. It's a constantly shifting environment of regulatory headwinds and tailwinds.
Section 6. An ecosystem in evolution. Synthesizing the double lens.
When we put it all together, we see that true financial viability in solar development is essentially an equation with two very distinct variables. To succeed, a company must master the physical, hardware limitations of legacy grids through constant innovation, while simultaneously adapting its business model to wildly fluctuating energy policies and utility tariff reforms. You simply cannot successfully evaluate a solar developer's market position without carefully weighing both sides of this scale. Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on as we watch the energy sector evolve. Will technological innovation ultimately outpace our infrastructure limitations, finally allowing us to build a truly decentralized grid? Or will political policy and regulatory frameworks always act as the speed limit for the solar revolution? It is a complex, high-stakes race between engineering adaptation and political regulation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.